Teachers at the prestigious Robertson Conservatory routinely dismissed Lillian Porter, the quiet new assistant. When a crisis strikes during an important recital, they force her to attempt an impossible piano piece. Little do they know that the simple woman they've been belittling is actually one of the world's most celebrated pianists. The hallowed halls of the Robertson Conservatory thrummed with their usual symphony, the repetitive rhythm of scales from practice rooms, clipped critiques from professors, and the occasional exasperated sigh drifting through the corridors. Amid it all, Lillian Porter moved like a shadow, unobtrusive, efficient, nearly invisible. She dusted piano keys with practiced care and rearranged sheet music without a sound. At 38, Lillian blended into the background by design. Her chestnut hair, always pulled into a simple braid, matched the modest navy dress she wore each day. Her steps were quiet, her presence muted. 6 weeks into her position as administrative assistant, most of the faculty barely acknowledged her existence, just as she preferred. Ms. Porter, these need to be arranged by composer, not chronologically. Dr. Constance Whitmore's voice sliced through the air with the precision of a baton, sharp, deliberate. The formidable head of piano studies didn't look up from her leather-bound planner as she handed Lillian a thick stack of papers. Of course, Dr. Whitmore, I'll correct it immediately. Lillian took the sheet music gently, her voice soft but steady. Whitmore gave a perfunctory nod and strode down the corridor, her heels echoing against the marble floor like a metronome. Lillian watched her go, the corners of her mouth lifting in a ghost of a smile. As she resorted the papers, her eyes paused on one, Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth. Her fingers twitched instinctively. Even after all this time, muscle memory stirred at the sight of those furious, familiar notations. 5 years since she'd last performed. Daydreaming on the job, Ms. Porter. Professor Walter Thornton's voice jolted her from reverie. The conservatory's elderly composition instructor peered over his glasses, his ever-crooked bow tie in place. Just organizing, Professor? Lillian replied quickly, her fingers resuming their work. When you're done, Madame Dubois needs help preparing for the scholarship competition. Something about program notes. I'll go right away. Thornton lingered, watching her deftly sort the pages. You know, he said, his tone edged with doubt. For someone with no formal musical background, you handle those scores like someone who understands them. Eyes downcast, Lillian offered a gentle shrug. I've picked up a few things over the past 6 weeks. Understanding music is more than shuffling papers. It requires years of discipline, training, and breeding. She nodded, unfazed. I wouldn't presume otherwise, Professor. Apparently satisfied, he shuffled off, muttering about the days when staff remembered their place. That afternoon, Lillian tapped gently on the office door of Madame Elizabeth Dubois, the conservatory's revered and feared French performance coach. Entrez, came the curt command. Madame Dubois sat amid an avalanche of papers, spectacles perched imperiously on her nose. At 65, she remained a figure of immaculate discipline, silver hair coiled in a flawless chignon, posture straight as a conductor's baton. Ah, Ms. Porter. Finally, these program notes are atrocious. They must be retyped and perfect by tomorrow. The donors expect nothing less. Of course, madam. Lillian accepted the pages, her eyes catching the red-inked edits bleeding across the margins. And do make sure there are no mistakes this time. We cannot afford another embarrassment like last week. The embarrassment in question had been a single misplaced accent on a French composer's name. A mistake Madame Dubois had made herself. Lillian had caught it but hadn't dared correct her. Superior. I'll be meticulous, she said simply. As she turned to go, her eyes drifted to the open score on Madame's piano. Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth, the very piece she'd seen earlier. Will Gregory Palmer be playing this tomorrow? She asked before she could stop herself. Madame Dubois's brow arched like a raised bowstring. Yes. Why? It's... Lillian hesitated, then spoke carefully. A formidable choice for a student. Mr. Palmer is our most gifted pianist. He thrives on challenge. A pause. And I hardly think you're in a position to assess the difficulty of a Liszt transcription, Miss Porter. You're right. My apologies. The morning of the scholarship competition buzzed with nerves and hushed excitement. Donors in tailored suits and strands of pearls mingled with conservatory faculty beneath the crystal chandeliers of the grand foyer. In tucked-away practice rooms, students rehearsed furiously, desperate to quiet the trembling in their hands. Lillian arrived early. She wore her best navy dress, still modest but freshly pressed, and her braid was a touch neater than usual. Today's event would determine who would receive the prestigious Robertson Scholarship, a full ride that had the power to launch a career. Miss Porter, thank heaven, Professor Thornton called, waving her over. He stood with a cluster of board members near the reception table. The programs, please. She handed him the still warm stack from the press room. Excellent. He skimmed the top page briefly before distributing them to the gathered donors. Now, we need you backstage. The students are in various states of meltdown as usual. Backstage was barely controlled chaos. Nervous young musicians paced, whispered scales under their breath, or sat still with eyes closed, silently willing themselves to stay calm. Gregory Palmer, the conservatory's star student, stood apart, rigid, pale, hands trembling faintly. Mr. Palmer. Lillian approached, gentle but direct. Are you all right? He blinked at her as if seeing her for the first time. Fine, he muttered, though it was anything but convincing. You're playing the Liszt, aren't you? I heard you rehearsing yesterday. It sounded beautiful. Gregory blinked, his focus sharpening. You were listening? Lillian offered a small, kind smile. It's hard not to, when something's played with such feeling. He hesitated, then glanced down. But the technical passages. He shook his head. I don't know if I can pull it off. Not today. Not with everyone watching. A familiar pang echoed in Lillian's chest. That pressure, like a weight pressing against the ribs. She remembered it well. May I? She asked, motioning toward his score. Looking puzzled, Gregory handed it over. Most administrative staff could barely read lead sheets, let alone advanced piano transcriptions. Lillian flipped to the section he'd been struggling with. You're attacking this too aggressively, she said softly. Yes, Liszt demands power, but it's about control, not brute force. Try imagining it as waves, not lightning. Gregory stared. How do you know that? Too late, Lillian realized her mistake. She quickly returned the score. Just something I overheard Madame Du Bois tell another student once. Before he could respond, Dr. Whitmore swept in, clipboard in hand, every movement crisp and urgent. Places, everyone. Palmer, you're opening the program. She turned her eyes to Lillian, already dismissive. Ms. Porter, see to it the green room stays quiet. As Lillian stepped away, she heard Gregory murmur under his breath. Waves, not lightning waves. The recital began. 10 minutes in, chaos struck. A messenger whispered urgently to Dr. Whitmore. Gregory Palmer, sweating, pale, barely coherent, was in no state to perform. Panic flickered in the faculty's eyes. Donors waited. The audience was seated. Expectations were high. Professor Thornton pulled Lillian aside. You played, didn't you? He said abruptly. Once, somewhere. She met his gaze calm. Yes, you're the only option. Palmer's out, and someone has to go on. Madame Du Bois approached, expression unreadable. If you embarrass this institution, she said quietly, your employment will be terminated immediately. Do I make myself clear? Lillian nodded once, but inside her chest, her heart had begun to pound. Not from fear, but from something fiercer, long buried, anticipation. Professor Thornton shoved a score into her hands. At least try to glance at this while you play. Pretend you belong here. Lillian accepted it with a small, serene smile. I won't need it, but thank you. Before anyone could react, the stage manager motioned sharply. 30 seconds. Dr. Whitmore inhaled, fixed a brittle smile to her face, and stepped out onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, voice ringing clear. "Due to an unforeseen circumstance, Gregory Palmer will be unable to perform. Fortunately, we have another pianist who will present Liszt's transcription of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony." Backstage, Lillian closed her eyes. She flexed her fingers slowly. 5 years of rebuilding, of silence, of wondering whether she'd ever return. Now she stood again, not as Lillian Porter, invisible assistant, but as Lillian Kurtz. The applause that greeted her was tepid, polite. In the front row, Dr. Whitmore sat ramrod straight beside Professor Thornton, both with frozen expressions. Madame Dubois leaned forward, gaze sharp. The grand piano glistened beneath the lights, its lid open, its possibilities endless. Lillian approached with quiet purpose. She adjusted the bench with practiced ease. The audience, sensing something, shifted. She sat, breathed, and then the first chords thundered through the hall. Liszt's daring transcription roared to life under her hands. Beethoven's unmistakable motif rendered with orchestral depth and singular intimacy. From the outset, it was clear. This was no amateur.
No sabste tot.
This was. The name moved through the audience like wind through dry leaves. Lillian Kurtz, the child prodigy who'd once electrified Europe. The virtuoso silenced by tragedy. The artist who vanished after Vienna. And now here, alive, whole, playing not as a shadow of her past self, but as a force reborn. The final movements arrived. Her hands, once damaged, now restored, delivered their last declaration. Her sound surged, then softened and finally stilled. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. Then the hall erupted. The ovation was thunderous, instant. Donors rose, students wept. Faculty stood as though compelled by something divine. "Brava!" someone shouted. In the back row, an elderly man sobbed into his handkerchief. Lillian sat quietly at the piano, hands resting in her lap. Not playing now, just receiving. Not music, but recognition. She stood, bowed. The applause surged. On stage, Dr. Whitmore remained frozen, her expression vacant. Professor Thornton had stopped pretending altogether. He simply shook his head, astonished. Only Madame Dubois stood with the audience, her face alight with pride. As Lillian bowed once more, she caught Gregory Palmer watching from the wings, his earlier panic replaced with wonder. She offered him a gentle smile before turning back to the crowd. At last, Dr. Whitmore stirred. She rose stiffly, stepped to the microphone. Her voice wavered. "Ladies and gentlemen, please." A pause. "It seems we owe you an explanation." She turned toward Lillian. "Would you care to introduce yourself properly, Miss Porter? Or should I say, Miss Kurtz?" The air in the room changed. Lillian stepped forward. The stage lights were warm on her face. The weight of secrecy lifted. "Yes," she said simply. "I am Lillian Kurtz." Gasps, murmurs, a ripple of disbelief. A silver-haired man leaned to his companion. "Kurtz, the greatest interpreter of Liszt of her generation." Whitmore forced a brittle smile. "Perhaps you could explain why one of the world's most celebrated pianists has been working as an administrative assistant at our conservatory for the past 6 weeks. It was a trap meant to shame. It failed." Lillian's voice was steady. 5 years ago, I suffered an injury that doctors believed would end my career. After surgeries and a long rehabilitation, I didn't know if I could or should return to the stage. I came here to rediscover my relationship with music. Quietly, away from pressure, away from expectation. She turned to the faculty. "I chose Robertson Conservatory because of its reputation for excellence. I wanted to learn again, as a student, not a symbol." Madame Dubois joined her on stage, graceful as ever. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" she asked softly. Lillian offered a faint smile. "Would you have treated me the same if I had?" Silence answered her. Then, from the audience, the silver-haired man stood. "Ms.
Kurtz. I'm Robert Dansen."
My foundation came today in search of rising talent. Instead, we witnessed a triumphant return. Would you consider offering a masterclass to our scholars?" Before Lillian could speak, Whitmore cut in. her tone suddenly warm and performative. The Robertson Conservatory would be honored to host Ms. Kurtz for a full series of master classes. In fact, we've been discussing an artist-in-residence position for some time. Lillian raised an eyebrow, but said nothing of the fabrication. Danson smiled. Wonderful. In that case, we'll increase our funding. Talent like this deserves nothing less. As Whitmore and Danson conferred, Professor Thornton approached, visibly uneasy. Miss Kurtz, I owe you an apology for not recognizing your talent. Lillian replied gently, You never looked for it, Professor. We see what we expect to see. He flushed, nodded. I hope you'll consider staying, under more appropriate terms. The faculty clustered nearby, suddenly eager to be close. But Lillian's attention drifted to Gregory, still watching from the wings. She stepped away from the crowd to meet him. He struggled for words. I've never heard anything like it. You will, she said, with time and the right guidance. His eyes lit. Will you teach me? She smiled. I'd be honored, but only if you promise to play for yourself, not for them. She nodded toward the bustling donors and flustered professors. In that moment, Lillian understood. Her next chapter wouldn't be about reclaiming her past. It would be about sharing what the journey had taught her. 1 month later, Lillian Kurtz sat in her new office at the Robertson Conservatory. The nameplate on the door read, Artist in Residence Dr. Whitmore and Professor Thornton now deferred to her with almost comical respect. Only Madame Du Bois remained the same, warm, grounded, and sincere. A knock. Gregory stepped inside, sheet music in hand. Professor Kurtz, he grinned. I've been practicing that passage the way you showed me. Let's hear it. He took a seat at the piano. As his fingers found the keys, Lillian leaned back, listening. She smiled. Everything had changed. Sometimes the most powerful revelations don't come from hiding who we are, but from finding the courage to be seen again.